Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice is a novel written by Jane Austen in the 19th century. And it is curious how this novel is a very famous work, a classic of English and universal literature. I would like to start by saying the expectations that the book has regarding the title. And this is that this book has many implicit and explicit messages from the title and through the chapters. For example, it talks a lot about first impressions, how they can be lived once, how complex it is to change our thinking regarding the first impressions we have of people, and at the same time, how wrong they can be because we don't know people such as we can even judge or categorize them by these first impressions. On the other hand, Pride and Prejudice can tell us about the portrait of a society at that time and how we let ourselves be influenced by things that we shouldn't, such as the Pride and Prejudice. In order to understand this story better, I had to investigate its context and I was able to understand everything literally. Like the story was located in England at the time of the Greater, and I also understand the division of the English society. It was divided into two. The one that was governed by the educated, those who went to the university, were from the highest class, and the other called rural and more conservative. And these rural and more conservative were the women married very young as from the 60 years. So the women looked for a rich and a single man who they learned to do various trades such as sewing, cooking, reading, knowing how to weave, playing the piano, knowing how to dance, being the most beautiful and everything. In those times, they want to be like more independent because they were like living with their parents, so that's why this is the necessity to look up for a woman so they can have a better life and all these things that it is important for they in that time, such as have a house and their independence, by the way. And this is like how to like we need to understand this context please before like start reading the book because it is so different that post that we have nowadays. For example, now women is more independent or it's not it can be like more seen in that way like you need to look up for a man who's rich like people can call you are interested like I'm not that. That's why people can think in nowadays, but in that time it was like really different. Nothing as it is in this. Starting with the story, there is the Bennet family in concentration like Lizzie Bennet, the protagonist, the second of five sisters, Jane the oldest and the most beautiful. She was even asked to marry her when she was only 15 years old. And not only physical beauty, but also inner beauty. Lizzie and Jane are very close. The difference is that Lizzie is the opposite of Jane. Jane is like the sweetest girl, and Lizzie is prejudiced, this awful, and knows that she is too old to get married. Mary is the less graceful. Then there is Kitty and Lydia, the youngest and the craziest. Their parents, Mr. Bennet, someone very calm compared to Mrs. Bennet, who was an urgency to marry all his daughters since none of them were married, and the father could be about to die for what he thought that they could be left in the ring. One day, they went to a dance in the town of Longerhorn, which all sisters attended. This being a place where one could get a partner. So Mrs. Bennet immediately introduced all her daughters without exception. By then, there were two special guests. A new neighbor, who is Mr. Bingley, someone who was rumored to earn about £500 a year, and a very wealthy man who was accompanied by Darcy, Mr. Darcy, who earns about 10,000 pounds a year, who by the way was single. Mr. Bennet had of course seen that and wanted to do her best to get them to handcuff one of her daughters. She really didn't much because Mr. Bingley had an almost instant connection with her. Mr. Darcy, on the other hand, was perceived as a proud person, conceited and rude, unpleasant, and all the bad adjectives. He didn't speak to anyone all night, and he didn't want to dance with anyone. When Lizzie sees this, she thinks and almost swears that he would be the last man she would be interested in, no matter how rich he was. And this is where this story begins. Lizzie meets him at this party, and she thinks that for a lot of money, she wouldn't even get attention from him. Like, she was not interested in him because of his attitude. As there was this romance between Jen and Bingley, they began to see more and get to know Lizzie and Darcy more. And that is how they get closer and closer. And this is how Lizzie realized that it was not good to judge it by a first impression. And that's how the whole story is understood. Despite the fact that they didn't like each other very much at the first time, Darcy gets carried away a lot by her class pride and Lizzie by her prejudice towards men. Little by little, the story advances, the connection is so obvious, they hate each other, and worse, they look for each other, they kind of stand off each other, but they don't stop talking to each other. So they were in love and they are in love. And it seems to me very good how the author approaches this story. She does not didn't romanticize anything, but she approaches the story as two real people with jealousy, selfishness. They carried away by vanity, pride, they made mistakes and leftovers and leftovers and involved through the novel, and this is not the typical love story. So I love this part. Like, she was very original while she was writing this because it was not the typical novel as in those times people used to read. So I really appreciate that. Like Jane did a great well. I found the compartments of the society of those times very interesting, as they communicate based on rumors, where they went out and have fun and flirt. I loved the plot and the development of this story, and it made me realize all these aspects, such as first impressions, and that it's not important to judge people for that very reason without first taking the time to get them and know them better. On the other hand, I must admit that the book didn't catch my attention at the first time because of the type of writing, the complex vocabulary, and in general, that it has very plots that confuse the reader. So yeah, it was like, oh my god, I can understand it well at all. However, I do recommend it because it's so important for me to understand it. So you can recognize how valuable this literary work it is. Like, it's a classic. I hope you enjoy it if you read it. It works, and take time to read it and to understand it, so you can catch out the story and why it was like this, and obviously understand the context first. Thank you for watching my video. I hope you enjoy my review, and this is how I understand about what I read. So I hope you like it, teacher.